our recording. So if you remember last week, we talked about, a lot about English history and then leading down into the English Reformation. And I said there would be a test. So everybody took a blank piece of paper and drew out the entire Plantagenet family tree through the Wars of the Roses, right? Everybody can do that from memory on demand now?
Probably couldn't do it even if I had the chart up.
I might could draw the lines.
Okay, that's something. I could draw boxes and lines. Whether I could fill them in and connect them right, I don't know.
Right.
I jokingly said this is sort of the big picture of that, but without going too far back for a review, this is sort of the. That's not it. That's an entirely different set of slides. That this is sort of the simplified version of that. We talked about why this was important, in that the English crown had just gone through this, essentially a civil war called the Wars of the Roses, where two halves of the predominant house, which was the House of Plantagenet that held the throne, fought against each other, and then ultimately Henry VII, we talked about last week, reunites these sort of two divided houses of the House of Plantagenet, the House of Lancaster and the House of York, into the House of Tudor. And we did that whole background just to set the context. But the other reason for doing that whole background was to sort of emphasize why it's always important for monarchs to have a line of succession. That's still true today. But it was even more emphasized by Henry VII and then his son Henry VIII. And somebody remember why we said that was even more sort of front of mind for Henry VIII? That he have a male heir?
Because it was already a little bit in question regarding was he even the legitimate king?
Yeah, it had literally been just a few decades before that his father Henry VII had united this under the Tudor household, and I remember the other thing that happened specifically with Henry VII and translating to Henry VIII.
Oh, Arthur.
Yeah.
He wasn't the first son.
Yeah. Henry wasn't even the older son. His older brother Arthur should have taken the throne, but what happened to him?
He died.
He died. So there was this fresh reminder for Henry, by the very fact that he was sitting on the throne, that the fact that the eldest heir could easily die.
How long? Because I know that Arthur and Henry's parents were alive when Arthur died. How long was his dad still the king before he ended up becoming king?
If you look here, you should be able to see this is without all those connectors that I created. Here's Henry VII, who married Elizabeth of York. That
When did he die?
reunited the houses. There's Arthur. Arthur died in 1502. Henry died in 1509. So there were 7 years between Arthur's death and Henry VIII acceding to the throne. Remember, the other reason for going through this background, because this does play into the English Reformation, is that, remember, originally Catherine of Aragon, the Spanish princess, had been married to, very briefly, to Henry's older brother Arthur, and then Arthur had died, and then getting special dispensation from the Pope, Henry married Catherine. And then ultimately, when it came to the situation with Henry not being able to have a male heir that lived through Catherine, the rationale given to Henry's reason for annulling or divorcing was the fact of the of this special arrangement that it can be made. We looked at some of the biblical verses last week that can be argued on both sides of whether Henry's marriage to Catherine was valid or not. Everybody remember that? We looked at some passages actually back in the book of, I can pull it up here, through the magic of magic PowerPoint, specifically two passages in Leviticus about relationships, sexual relationships between a brother's wife, that also a man shall not marry his brother's wife. Specifically, it says they will be childless. And so this was the rationale that was used for Henry to seek his divorce or the annulment of the marriage to Catherine. That's me trying to hit the high points of the history so we don't spend forever going through the history part, which is fascinating, and which you can find tons of mini series and other things because it's got all kinds of drama attached to it. Anybody have any questions about that sort of background before we sort of pick back up with Henry and Protestantism and then move forward with that inside of the English Reformation? All right, hearing none, we'll move forward. So when we say that there was an English Reformation, the other thing that I mentioned last week was the fact that there had been some reform-minded ideas that had originated in England before. Does anybody remember anything about any of that, who some of the earlier English reformers were?
Huss.
Huss was not actually from England, but Huss was at the same time in Bohemia. The one that we probably know the best
Wycliffe.
was Wycliffe. And that was about a century before, at the same time as Jan Hus. And Wycliffe was one of the first to be a proponent for the translation of the Bible into the common language, which was English. And he produced that. And then eventually his followers became known as Lollards. And so there had been Protestant leanings in England to a small degree, at least a century before. But England, as we find it at the time that Henry is assuming the throne and before then, is very much still Catholic. And remember, initially, when in some of the early years that Henry has taken the throne, 1509 moving forward, 1517, the date we should have driven into our heads now, the beginning of Luther's efforts to reform, the attacking of the theses. What did Henry do in response to Luther?
He condemned him.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, he condemned him.
He condemned him. And what else did he do?
He writes against it.
He actually wrote a book defending the Catholic concept of the sacraments, the 7 things, against the Lutheran attack, which says that there were really only 2 ordinances within the church. And so because of that, Henry was given the title by the Pope of Defender of the Faith. He was married to Catherine, who is a very, very, very strong, devout Catholic. Spain was by far one of the strongholds inside of the Catholic part of the division that was happening as a result of the Reformation. And so England early on, up until Henry's desire and need for this divorce because of his succession crisis, what's referred to in English history as the King's Great Matter, was very much Catholic. The thing to recognize is that even though Henry changed the church, you remember the year for that, and the big event for that was, we talked about back on our departure graph here, we're looking at 1534, is that the 1534 break is recognized by what? What happened in 1534?
Is that the where he said that the English monarch was the only supreme head of the church?
That's correct. It's called the Act of Supremacy. And what it did was said that only the English monarch has the right and authority to be the supreme head of the church inside of his country. So let's stop here because we spent a lot of time last week talking history, even though it's relevant history. Let's flip over, and we talked a little theology. We looked at those verses in Leviticus, also versus Levirate marriage. But let's focus in on the theology here. What was the concept behind saying that a king trumped a pope? Because that's essentially what Henry was saying. Where does that come from in Scripture?
Well, I mean, obviously King Jesus trumps anybody else, but I don't know. I don't know what you're looking for exactly.
Okay, well, yeah, if you're ranking your trump cards, Jesus is the ace of spades if you're playing spades, no doubt. And it's a fair thing to put that back on me, Donna, which is we spent a little bit of time talking about this. Remember, we talked about the investiture controversy that arose in the 13th century about whether
Yeah.
the king could select who the clergy was. This really was, in many ways, the continuing manifestation of the question of who has.
Please. Okay.
Hey, Don.
Yeah. Go ahead. So
Hey, Don, like in Kings and Chronicles, I guess you see how David would have trumped the prophet Samuel, or even Saul was like ahead of Samuel. And then maybe you've seen again in Kings and Chronicles where the king had made decisions or I guess maybe overstepped the prophet of the time.
Yeah, I think that's an important thing to understand, Albert, is this tension between the political authority and the religious authority is not some unique modern thing. It's not some unique medieval thing or Reformation or Renaissance thing here. It goes back to the Old Testament. It certainly existed in New Testament times when Christ was there. And, ultimately, one way I think to think of the Bible as a whole is one of the central themes of the Bible is a question of who has authority, right? God's authority in our life. That's an Old Testament and a New Testament concept. So I don't think that that's new. It was struggled with during New Testament times, particularly the passages that we normally see relating to Christian relationship with civil authority is what Paul's writing in the book of Romans, right? And what does Paul basically tell us there? I think he gives, in my interpretation, in my reading, that he gives us a hard word. He says basically we're responsible as believers to submit to the authorities that have been ordained over us. And that can be a tough thing when we may disagree with those authorities that are ordained over us, right?
But Don, in the United States military, if I'm in the United States military and I receive an order that I think is immoral, I don't have to obey it.
In fact, it's been argued you have an obligation not to, correct?
That's correct.
It goes beyond just saying that you can. The suggestion there in the American, but not just in the American military tradition, but other military traditions, is that you should. If it's an immoral order, then it's immoral.
Yeah, it's only the matters that go against God's commands and what Scripture ordains.
Yeah.
That we can say no to, I guess.
And so mainly it's Romans 13 that are the passages there. But again, this is tricky in the sense of, we have scriptural writing that says we're supposed to be subject to authority, but then we have a higher authority that we're supposed to be subject to than the civil authority. And so when the decision is made here by Henry to say, I'm the authority of the church, the Pope is not, we know the backdrop for that. We've already talked about that. The backdrop for that was he wanted his annulment. He wanted his divorce and the reasons that he wanted that to happen. But he's raising an important question that will come up throughout has come up before and will come up again through church history, which is how should the church be organized from what you might call church polity? And not saying the church has politics, but what should be the organizational and authority structure of the church? So who is the head of the church? Christ, who is God, and he represents God, the whole Trinity thing. We spent a lot of time talking about that. So Jesus is the head of his church. is there a hierarchy that falls under Christ?
Within a local body, you mean?
Or just in general? Because that's also part of the question. Is there just is that hierarchy just in the local body, or does that hierarchy extend beyond the local body?
Well, it extends within a marriage.
Okay. Which is the ultimate small unit, right?
Right.
And so what we're going to see, particularly as we move through a lot of these different, as we move through the different denominations and interpretations of faith here, we're going to see that this is an important question. And a lot of what has divided some of us from other denominations is our view. I'm talking about a Baptist view. What is scriptural about how the church should be organized? And for example, Baptists hold to very much a local congregational lead in that. We are very much more in the area of what we talked about earlier when we were looking at definitions a few weeks back. We are very much congregationalist in that sense. The local congregation under the leadership of a pastor. By the way, who gets to choose that pastor? The local congregation. So that even emphasizes even more the power of the local congregation. The Methodist church down the street, how do they get their pastor?
It's decided for
From
them
their
by a governing body.
by their governing body.
Right, it's appointed from a governing body at least one layer up, right? Who's the priest at the local Catholic church? Whoever is appointed to be there, and that's several layers up that process goes through. So the question, which is actually one of the questions that Henry is dealing with here, whether we think of it that way in 1534, is what is the organizational structure of the church? And it can be argued that what change did Henry make? Did he make a large change or a small change?
Large.
I would agree with that. If you had said small, I would have also said I agree with that. Because it's a big change, moving away from the Pope being the ultimate authority, given the political context of that time and how that's played forward. But it's a small change. All he did was change one person on the org chart. Out
Yeah.
Pope in me.
Well, yeah, but the Pope still stays on the org chart. That's the problem.
That's true.
Yeah, but now they've been in authority.
They've been flipped.
Right. And so I think that's the biggest problem. If you just take him off of the org chart, but that didn't happen. He's still there. He still exists. So now you've got to have, when it comes down to authority, if you've got two people who are saying they've got the authority, I've had it, you've got it, there's no way in the world that the one who had authority is just going to say, oh yeah, you're right. You have the authority now.
Right.
That's not human nature at all. Once you have the authority, you don't want to lose that authority.
But and to take that again, we've used this org chart, which I think is a good way to think about it. That's the modern way we sort of interpret this. Is also the fundamental, not just the question of who's in what box on the org chart, because that matters. What's the relationship of the boxes on the org chart? I should have actually pulled this up. The most recent version of my company's org chart is the most convoluted thing you've ever seen. And the reason is we have what's called a matrixed org chart, which means that we report in different directions, and there's dotted lines and there's dashes and there's all kinds of other stuff that go with that. It's confusing. You look at the org chart, even if you know the organization, you go, how does this work? And if you don't know the organization, you go, how does this work? We've all seen simpler versions of that. One of the fundamental questions is, does the church even have an org chart? Or should the church even have an org chart? And that's actually one of the things we're going to come back to time and time again here, is that one of the distinctives between a number of the denominations inside of Christendom is around that question. How should the church be organized in terms of how it makes decisions and what it does? Does that make sense? That's a fundamental question. And we do it differently. Baptists do it differently than Methodists. Methodists do it differently than Anglicans. all of them do it differently than Catholics. There is a spectrum here to be covered, and understanding that becomes really important because it's also one of the many places where these division points will happen as we go through. So I don't want to lose the fact that, because we often talk about Henry's introduction of Protestant thought into England being very political, and I think that it was when Henry first introduced it. It has something that goes even deeper. Flipping this over to Luther and what's going on inside at the same time here, Luther is challenging what? Luther is challenging things like the sale of indulgences. He's challenging the interpretation of Scripture, the understanding of salvation. We've talked about all these things, but what does Luther eventually very quickly come to challenge?
The authority of the Pope.
The same thing. The authority of the Pope. And so this is a common theme that's going on during this particular time. The early part of the Reformation is, how will the church be organized? We're going to see that come back when we talk about Calvin. Again, we're going to see it as we go all through here. So I wanted to make sure that we hit it now a little bit. So generally speaking, for most of Henry's reign, let me go back to where we can easily see that time frame and that time period. During most of Henry's reign, and Henry reigns from 1509, 1534 is the Act of Supremacy. So that's a pretty good ways removed from 1517. And then he remains on the throne until 1547. So for another 13 years, several wives, some more kids. We've talked some about that. Henry moves England into the Protestant camp, but day in, day out, inside of everyday church, very little changed about how worship took place. It was now the Church of England, but they were still doing the Mass. Theology was very much still Catholic in almost every way that you can imagine. And so while the name had changed of the church, who was the head of the church had changed, the practice was still very similar to what was going on in Catholicism, even though they were, quote unquote, now, because of that change, thought of as being Protestant. Does that make sense?
Was the Pope still in Rome at this time, or
Yes.
had the Pope moved?
No, the Pope's still in Rome.
And who was the Pope?
That is Leo the 10th, if I'm remembering correctly. Somebody can correct me on that because that's off the top of my head.
And what did Leo the 10th think about?
Oh, he excommunicated Henry.
Right. But I mean, what was his defense? Like, how?
The defense of his position is the same position it's always been, is that it starts with that passage that we looked
The
at,
thing about
the keys being given to
keys
Peter,
being given to
and
Peter.
the concept of apostolic succession. So up through 1547 and Henry's death, England has moved to be Protestant, but they are still in practice primarily from a theological standpoint, Catholic, with the one change being the change of who the head of the church is. During this period of time, while Henry is there, a major force during this, we're going to come back and talk about it more, is Thomas Cranmer. It's important to get a sense of that name. He's a very important figure that runs through all of this. Cranmer was one of the ones who gave some of the justification, the scriptural justification, and other things for Henry to take this position of being the head of the church. And he becomes a much more influential person later. But again, Henry's theology is very much Catholic theology, except for the change and the removal of the Pope. As we talked about before, I'm just going to run through this just so it's there. Remember, Arthur dies, the throne passes to Henry. When Henry dies, the throne passes to Edward, who is his oldest surviving son. Edward is through his third marriage to Jane Seymour. He's had two daughters before that have lived to adulthood, Mary and Elizabeth. Mary was set aside when he divorced Catherine. In fact, she was made essentially illegitimate. Later, she's allowed to be made quasi-legitimate, but only by agreeing to the fact that the marriage that existed between Henry and Catherine, she had to recognize the annulment. And then Elizabeth comes from Henry's marriage to Anne Boleyn. So his third oldest child is the male child. And so Edward succeeds the throne in 1547 at the very young age of 9 years old. So Edward is on the throne because he's a male. The males took precedence over the females. And so the order of succession was Edward, Mary, Elizabeth. When Edward takes the throne, he is not old enough to reign in his own right. So a regency has to be set up. And what does a regency do for a king?
Rules.
Technically, who's ruling?
Technically the king, but he's appointed somebody to do it for him.
He has this council that's basically doing it in his stead if he's not of the age of majority. So here's the important thing to understand broadly about the English Reformation. Henry, Protestant essentially in name only. Edward, though, had been raised and was being taught by his tutors, a lot of the influential people that were in the Privy Council, which advised the king, and thus were part of the regency. More and more during the latter part of Henry's reign, Protestants had come to be more represented in that. So Edward's theological training, Henry's theological training had been very Catholic. In fact, we talked about before Arthur's death, Henry probably would have gone in and held a church position. Edward's theological education is much more influenced by Protestant Reformed thought. And he's also now 30 years removed from the start of the Reformation, from the 1517 tacking of the theses. So the Reformation has come a long way by the time Edward takes the throne and is taking more of a foothold in Europe. So Edward is much more inclined to and is influenced by Protestants. Any questions about that? Does that make sense?
Yes.
So while Protestant to Protestant is how you would describe the transition from Henry to Edward, it is a different form of Protestantism that we see really taking hold during the relatively short reign of Edward, and that's about 6 years. And part of the reason for that is this guy, is Cranmer. He is very much an influence during the period of time as part of the Privy Council. He's the Archbishop of Canterbury. He's a very powerful political figure, but also a powerful moving figure inside of English Protestantism, and he is very influential over Edward. So part of the reason that things are lurching more towards the Protestant mode of thought has a lot to do with Cranmer in his position and his influence on Edward. Now, some of the things that happens during Edward's reign, I'm just going to pull it up here. Sometimes there's those that call him England's Josiah, since he was a boy king. And in their mind, particularly if you come from the Protestant mode of thought, notice that this comes from a site that is leaning towards Protestantism. He's viewed as sort of being this, child king who was there to restore things the way they ought to be. The two biggest thing that happens underneath Edward that are important to understand is that you had the formulation of the 39 Articles of Religion. This is putting down in writing some creedal concepts, some basic fundamental concepts, but probably more than anything else, it's the introduction of the Book of Common Prayer, and it was used to replace the Catholic Missal. So remember, we talked about the difference between, or about the element of a liturgical type of worship. What's a liturgy?
Isn't it just, I don't know how to say it, repetitious practice?
It is a repetitious practice. Whether this is the right way to describe it, this is the way that I do it in my head. It's a little bit like the script for church.
Yeah.
So it walks through very in specific detail who's going to say what, who's going to do what are the right words, the songs that are sung, the scripture that's read, the statements that are reaffirmed that the whole congregation says. Those could be creeds or other things. And up until this time in England, even though they are Protestant, what have they been using in services? The services are still called Mass. It's the Church of England. The only thing that really changed for all intents and purposes was what? Who was the head of the church? Was the Pope. Was no longer there. That was Henry. So as they lean more Protestant and more the reform ideas get brought in, one of the things that happens is they author this thing. Actually, Cranmer was very involved in doing it, called the Book of Common Prayer. You've probably heard of the Book of Common Prayer. It was a published liturgy to be used for various types of services, the Mass, for funerals, for special events. It was what we think of today as being like a liturgy. And so when that was introduced, and by the way, it was introduced, guess in what language? English. So the Mass had still been going on for the most part in Latin. Some places were doing English Mass, but was still normally practiced in Latin. By the time Edward takes the throne and the Book of Common Prayer comes into being, now the practice of the actual worship service changes. How do you think that was received by most of the people in England?
Probably not well.
Generally not well. Some welcomed it because they were more leaning towards the Reformation, which had taken hold, but most of them saw that as a major change and something. Imagine if we started doing something entirely different at our church that we had never done before every week. Whether you were in favor of it or against it, you would go, the question would arise, why are we making this change, right? And we've all been in churches where even small changes, raise issues. Taking the offering up after the service versus taking the offering up in the middle of the service, right?
Yeah.
I've seen that and know of that to be something that churches have actually gone as far as almost fighting over. So imagine changing the entire order and style and substance of the service. Imagine what a powerful thing that would be. And so while they're leaning more towards the Protestant mode of thought under Edward, tension is also growing here because they're moving more truly in that direction. And I'm being repetitive here and long-winded about it, but I want you to get this idea. The people of England are lagging behind what the leaders are doing here. They're embracing this move away from the Catholic tradition that they've known up until 1534. They're moving away from it quite reluctantly as we move forward. Questions about that? Thoughts about
Well, I guess as with all change, do the people understand why the change is happening? I mean, are they just hearing, are they not being told why, or have they figured out the reason it's changing is because the king needed this annulment? I mean, like, how fast did the news really travel, and how fast, if you don't, if people have to endure change and don't understand the reason for the change, they're less likely to be on board with it. Yeah. So
it was a little.
How are they getting?
It was a little bit of both, and what made that even more complicated is understanding there's no, it's not like it's not like Henry or Edward could go on TV,
right? No, I get that.
and explain this is what we're doing and why, where everyone would hear it directly. Even though the king could issue a proclamation and that would go out, there was a better than even chance you couldn't read, so you had to have it read to you. And who probably read it to you? The local parish priest. And you add to that there were differences of opinion even among the clergy throughout England. So the short answer is yes, they understood, and they understood in a big sense why Henry had done this, because they knew the situation regarding succession and then the succession and then the progression of wives. But they also, at some degree, probably did not understand all of the theological implications that were being thought about by Cranmer and some of the others that were around Edward now in terms of why this was. So it was a little bit of both. And depending on what part of England you were in, you may have been more inclined to be leaning one way versus the other. Even inside of individual congregations, there were definitely divisions there. So this was a tedious time. You see some of the things in 1547. So this is the year that Edward takes the throne. He issues the injunctions at the behest of his Protestant advisors, the Privy Council. And so, like, for example, the removing of images. We talked about, the iconoclast thing. Church bells were taken down. You didn't see the vestments being the same way. Notice that suddenly clergy are allowed to be married. So that idea of do priests have to be celibate becomes this. So it's a change, again, moving away from what had been the traditional mode of worship, and not just the traditional mode of worship for a little while, the traditional mode of worship for a long time. So it starts under Edward. It gets advanced a little bit under Edward, as we see here. So there were rebellions that came as a result of this when this was attempted to be enforced. East Anglia, Devon, and Cornwall were the areas that were most traditionally Catholic. They came up. You still had some priests who continued to do what they wanted to do locally, even though it had come down from the head of the church to do something different. So there were areas where it was just easily taken on. There were other places where it was fought back. So this is not a simple. It's not just because Edward's now the king. Day 2 of Edward's reign, he says, we are now this. We're moving to this. And everybody goes, okay, the king said so, so we're moving. This was important to them. So there was tension that was growing there. That's the main thing that I want to get out there. And in fact, where the head of the tension tended to come around was the publication of the first Book of Common Prayer. It was a dramatic change. It took the place of the old liturgies that were there from Catholic tradition. First of all, it was in English. Second, one of the changes of the service was that some of the epistles and the gospels, the readings in the church were not done in Latin from the Vulgate. They were done in English. A big change in the Mass. Remember, in a Catholic service, every time you meet, you celebrate the Mass, which includes what? Includes
The Eucharist.
the Eucharist. Remember that we talked about this, I think, a little bit before. Prior to Luther and the Catholic Church, the bread was given to the laity, but the cup was reserved exclusively for the clergy. Remember, we talked about why that was? Anybody remember? You didn't want to risk actually spilling what they believed had become the blood of Christ. And so you kept it to, you protected that. So one of the big changes with the First Book of Common Prayer and the order of service that's laid out into it is the laity, non-clergy, were offered the cup as well as the bread. That may seem small when we just read it on a screen here or read it in words, but imagine what that was like in a church. You could be 60 years old in that church and have participated in the Eucharist, the Mass, week after week regularly. Maybe only a handful of times in your life, something like a confirmation type service or something like that, had you ever been offered the cup. At this crowning thing in the service, which is the Eucharist. And now suddenly they're talking to you in English. You're praying in English, the scriptures in English, and now you're being offered the cup. Pretty dramatic break from what you were common to. And in fact, it was no longer, you see there, it was entitled the Supper of the Lord and the Holy Communion, commonly called the Mass. It had been called the Mass for 1,000 years. And they were even renaming what it is you were doing. If you did not agree with these changes that were coming as a result of the Reformation and what more and more Protestants were doing, how do you think you felt about those changes?
Most probably felt uncomfortable with it.
Yeah. Do you think some of them worried about what this impact would have on their souls?
Yes, probably.
They weren't just uncomfortable with it because it was different. They were uncomfortable with it because it was different, but they were worried. This is not what I was taught when I was a child. What if doing it this way means that I'm going to go to hell, or in this case, I have to spend more time in purgatory to purge the fact that I haven't been doing Mass right? Like, we're not even calling it Mass anymore. We're calling it the Supper of the Lord.
So I'm sure it's because I grew up getting both the bread and the cup, but did the people just accept that in the past they were only given the bread?
But that's the way it had been.
Because that's the way it had been. They never questioned, why do I get the bread? Why is that okay, but the cup's not okay? just because the priest had decided.
Well, because the church had decided, again, believing in full transubstantiation. It literally had become the body and blood of Christ.
Yeah, see, because I have such a hard time with that.
And we're going to get to, by the way, we're going to talk more about that, because that's going to filter itself through all kinds of other things that we're going to talk about here. So we'll come back to this, what actually happens to the wine and the bread. But it was a major departure for them. So even though the decision has been made by Edward, they're becoming more all the way through the masses yet. So I think I've hit that. The Book of Common Prayer in 1552. And in fact, this one, which was heavenly authored by Cranmer, went even further in that it added in some language called the Black Rubric. I don't want to get into that, but this is where they really talked about what was going on with the bread and the wine. But the important thing to understand in this whole concept was that this went even much more in the Protestant direction. In fact, I read a number of sources, and I do really strongly recommend the Gordon Cornwell seminary video pieces that I posted in the link last week, which can be found on YouTube. They're really good stuff that Ryan Reeves does there, one of the professors there. But he talked about it. It seems like it was almost intentional that the 1549 book was like dipping toes into it, but it was sort of intentional that we'll do this a little bit at a time. 3 years later, here comes probably what we would have wanted to put out, but we realized it would be too radical. And so the second Book of Common Prayer is imposed, and it's viewed as even being more of a move. So you even have more conflict coming back by those that were concerned about this inside of the church. Edward takes the throne when he's 9. Probably one of the things we know best about Edward is what? He was a sickly boy. And this had been a concern all the way through. And so while he takes the throne in 1547, when we get to 1553, at the very young age of 15, something very dramatic happens. And that something very dramatic that happens is, you can probably guess, what happens to Edward.
He dies.
He dies. And so we've traced this through now, Henry the VII to Henry the VIII. Arthur is dead, so it had to come to Henry. Henry dies, it comes to Edward because he's the oldest male heir. Mary is still technically, at the time of Henry, in line to the throne because he has restored her to the succession because she was willing to at least agree on paper to the annulment of her mother's marriage to Henry. Mary is very what? Protestant or Catholic? She's like an uber Catholic, like her mom. And so because of that, Edward had been persuaded by his counselors to essentially change his will when it came to who the succession was going to be. And the person that he was looking to eliminate was, guess who? His older sister. And by the way, look how much older she is now. She was born in 1516. We are now to 1553. Mary is not just an older teenager. Mary is a full-blown 37-year-old adult who's already been passed over for the throne and was known during this period of time that I'm talking about with Edward to still being secretly holding to. She was she was kept away at an estate, not really under house arrest, but also not fully free to move. And she secretly kept a priest there who would administer the service to her in the Catholic form, even though technically England had become Protestant. So as we get to 1553, when Edward passes away, he has changed the succession to not be to his sister Mary, but to his cousin, her name is Jane Grey. She is Protestant, and that's part of the reason we looked at some of that, what you see here. She descends down through the line of Henry's sister, she's actually his grandniece, I guess is what it would be. So she can tie her lineage back to Henry VII indirectly, and we see her down here. And so when Edward dies, the Privy Council for didn't realize I'd done that, but that's okay. Let me take the let me take my annotation off of there. Is that she becomes the queen. The Privy Council, Protestant, doesn't want to put Mary on the throne. Who do they want to put on the throne? A Protestant. So Jane is put on the.
So at this point, the changes have come to where the women can have the throne.
They are willing to allow that to be the case because it's. Why do you think they're willing to allow that to be the case?
Because there's not a man.
And it's to their advantage.
It's to their advantage. And by the way, it would be a woman anyway, right?
It would be Mary.
It would be Mary. So most of us don't call her Mary the First. What do we call her?
Bloody Mary.
Bloody Mary. Why is she called Bloody Mary?
Because she probably was all into the blood of the Eucharist.
No, that'd be a great guess.
No, because she was all into killing Protestants.
Yeah. So what happens here is, remember, there is still that sentiment out in the English populace about two things. Let me close down the Jane Grey thing. She's queen for 9 days. You will see listings of the kings and queens of England, if they're listed in order, where you will not see Jane Grey, Lady Jane Grey, even listed, because she's queen for all of 9 days. Because that's how long it takes for Mary, who has already come down to near London, as her brother is on his deathbed under the guise of coming to visit him. She's not that far away. She's gone over to East Anglia, which is one of the areas that is much more aligned with keeping the Catholic theological tradition. And she's able to put together an army of about 20,000 soldiers who are ready to back her and to march into London and say, Henry VIII originally said, before Edward changed it, that Mary was going to be next in line to succession. And so they have two reasons for wanting to put her on the throne instead of Lady Jane Grey. Reason number one, she is more inclined to the Catholic theological tradition. Reason number two is there is a widespread belief, even among a lot of those that were okay with the Protestant moves, that she is the legitimate rightful heir when you look through how succession should have worked. It should have never, they'll agree that it should have skipped over Mary for Edward because of preferring males, but it should have never skipped to this distant cousin, even though that's what Edward and his Protestant advisors wanted. So Lady Jane Grey not only sits the throne for 9 days, but guess what happens to her?
She's executed.
She's executed. Can't have her around raising trouble or bringing things up. So
and
part of the
what
reason
Mary's doing?
It was at Mary's order.
Okay.
Mary had, it's tough to get a number here. During her reign, she had at least 350 to 400 Protestants executed, including, and we'll talk about this a little bit here in a minute. Remember, we talked about Thomas Cranmer. Remember, he was the major influence. He was the one that had primarily authored the second book of Common Prayer. Guess what his fate was?
Execution.
Ultimately, execution. Initially, he was given the chance to recant, which I admire Cranmer for a lot of reasons. One of the reasons I admire Cranmer is I can identify with him. Initially, he does recant to preserve his life. But then he actually realizes, no, my conviction is the other, and so he goes back in the other direction. And ultimately, he is executed pretty violently. That's in 1556, if my memory is serving correctly. Mary's reign is from 1553 to 1558. So Edward's reign is a very short 6 years. Mary's reign is a very short 5 years. So within the space of, let's call it 11 years, just to make the math easy, what goes on in England and religious practice?
A change.
It's-
Now we've got to change again.
It's whiplash, is the best way I know to describe it. Under Henry, up until his death, things are still mostly Catholic in the way that worship takes place. The transition to Edward, we've already talked about that. And now Mary assumes the throne and things swing back violently in the other direction.
So Don, did you say that Jane was Edward's cousin?
Yes.
Okay.
She descends, I'm trying to remember how this works. Mary Tudor was Henry's sister. She is the granddaughter of Henry's sister.
Okay.
So Edward and Jane Grey are one generation removed from each other, but they are cousins.
Okay.
So yeah, here's the path here. There's Mary Tudor, who is Henry's sister. Her second marriage to the Duke of Charles, the Duke of Suffolk, produces Frances Brandon, who is a daughter, by the way. And then that daughter marries Henry Grey. That produces Jane.
Okay.
So even here, the path down to Mary is through a woman, and so that's why a lot of the people of England still said, no, may not agree with Mary's religion, but she's the legitimate queen.
Okay.
So she is known as Bloody Mary. That's a fair epitaph, but let me also put this in context. Had Henry had people executed?
Yes.
Most notably, we talked about one that he had executed last week. Mary, remember who that was? William Tyndale, who had translated scripture into English. Remember, they chased him into Belgium, where he's finally hunted down and he's executed in Antwerp, Belgium. Was it common for monarchs of this day to have people of all types executed for all kinds of reasons?
All the time.
Yes.
Yes. Does that mean that Mary should have gone around killing Protestants? No, I'm
No.
not justifying that, but I'm saying that Mary, in that sense, it can be argued from her historical context, was no different than any other monarch sitting a throne anywhere in the world or in Europe at that time because of political insurrection or religious issues. People were getting killed all over the place for all kinds of reasons at the order of monarchs. Mary is not unique to that. One of the things that I looked at was, we haven't got to Elizabeth's reign yet, we'll get there today, is that Elizabeth probably had over 1,200 to 1,300 folks executed. We don't call her Bloody Elizabeth. Part of the reason we don't do that is that happened over a very long reign. She reigned for right around 50 years. But part of that was the old adage, I know Mickey can jump in here, who gets to write the history? The victors.
Yeah, the winners.
The winners get to write the history. So in the way things that play out, Elizabeth is more on the side of being on the victorious side. So her executions are putting down heretics. Mary's executions are putting down people that should have never been put to death. Mary was fervent in what she did. I'm not going to back off of that. And when you consider that those 300, 350, 400 deaths happened during a 5-year period of time, that was pretty intense.
Were they mainly just put to death over their religious stuff, or were they put to death because they also in some way questioned her right to be the authority?
Both.
Queen.
Both. And those things were interconnected.
Right. Well, because if she held to Catholicism, then did she submit to the Pope? Or did she feel like
she undid the act of supremacy? The Pope was put
undid the act of
the Pope was
supremacy.
put back in charge of the.
So all of the other stuff that had kind of happened in the Protestant.
It's almost like, forget all that. That was that.
We're gonna go back to exactly the way it was before all of that happened.
Correct.
So Mary did that, and then 9 days later it gets flip-flopped.
Well, not Jane Grey comes in at 9 days, but she
Jane Grey just continues what Edward had
Right.
already started.
Jane Grey was Edward's designated successor because she was Protestant, but that doesn't last. 9 days and she's executed, and then you get married. She hated Cranmer with a passion because she viewed him as being the primary person who, and also, yes, that was one of the main reasons, but also because he had also been very active and fervent in moving things forward. He was the author of that second book of Common Prayer just the year before. So that's why he is sort of singled out among all of the others that she had put to death. He's probably the most notable there and is considered a martyr. And so he actually died in 1556. I had the year wrong, is when he actually there. And he refused, he actually called the Pope the Antichrist. So that's where he went to in terms of when he came back the other way.
Will you go back to the screen? Yeah. So a lot of her grudge had to do with the fact that her mother was a devout Catholic.
And was set aside by Henry. Her birth was made illegitimate. This is while she was an adult.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
It was only later that, she and Henry came to terms and she got back in his good graces enough to be initially in the line. When Henry died, Henry's declaration or his expression of how the succession should work is obviously Edward first, but then Mary would be next. So this was the rationale behind restoring or putting Mary on the throne, was we're just doing what Henry VIII originally wanted before Edward got influenced by those Protestants on the Privy Council and went in a different direction. But the thing I want you to grasp, this is not the history. This is the history part, but not the royal history part. Imagine what it was like to be the average churchgoer in England during that 11-year period of time. The minimum thing you can say that it was unstable
and confusing.
That's the kindest thing I think that I can say about it. I literally think, and you see this portrayed very often in documentaries and even in historical dramas, the people sort of didn't know what was okay to say and not okay to say, because what's okay today may not be okay tomorrow. You're at the winds of political change, which the political change brings about theological change. Again, now going back to the concept of who is the head of the church. Does Jesus do this about theology all the time? Lick his finger and check the direction of the wind?
No.
No, it's very constant, right? He's God, the unchanging one. So this idea about where church authority comes from is very important. This is something that we don't even have to especially in this country, we don't even really have to deal with this today. We just take this for granted. This was not something they could take for granted during this period of time. It also very heavily colors how the Church of England claimed to be, how it changed, and what it would become. They had gone through in the early period of the Church of England, all of this contention, the back and the forth. But again, Mary doesn't live for long. Mary dies in 1558. Now the succession passes to her younger half-sister, Elizabeth. Elizabeth I, you probably know, even if you don't know a lot about English history, you probably know as much or more about Elizabeth I. Henry VIII and Elizabeth I were sort of the poster children for British monarchy going back in time. The Elizabethan age. Elizabeth reigns for a very long period of time. So Elizabeth takes the throne at the end of this 11-year, I'm going to call it the whipsaw period. And what is she inheriting now?
A mess.
A mess. She is inclined theologically to be a Protestant because she was raised in that tradition and is willing to go there. But she is also very sensitive to the fact that this back and forth is the damage that it was doing to the people and the damage that's doing to her country. And so as a result, when it comes to the theological, what goes on theologically under Elizabeth's reign, is she very much is very often looking to find a middle ground, just settling things down. Not to mention that England's dealing with pressure from political pressure from the continent and other places. One thing I should mention, because this is important, is that Mary, remember, took the throne at the age of 37, having never been married and childless. So part of the reason that Elizabeth is able to take the throne is that Mary only reigns for 5 years and never produces an heir. Did Mary get married? The answer
I
is
thought
yes.
she did.
Yeah, she ended up being married to Philip II, who was the king of Spain. Now, it was agreed that during that he would not become, technically he was king of England, but that he would not reign in England. But very much that aligned England back with Spain, which at that point in particular was the strongest nation in the Catholic camp during the Reformation. And so an interesting thing about Mary, in fact, there's an interesting thing about this whole thing. There seems to have been a lot of gynecological issues that were just in this line of women. Remember, Mary is Catherine's daughter, and it's pretty clear that Catherine probably had issues there. Twice during her marriage to Philip, Mary claimed or thought, it's a little unclear, she was pregnant. And ultimately, she died from intestinal or a form of intestinal cancer. And so trying to diagnose it back, what we don't know is whether or not these were psychosomatic pregnancies or whether there were things going on in her body that she mistook for being pregnant. But at least on one occasion, and from what I understand, both occasions, she got to the point of where she was like, okay, I think I'm ready to give birth. And then nothing happened, which is sort of an interesting, just historical side note. But because Philip had been married to her, Spain felt like they had a some say in English politics. So Elizabeth takes the throne. Sorry, go ahead.
Real quick. It says that burning. So is that how Mary put most of the people to death? It wasn't the beheadings and stuff like that?
Most of the people were burned.
Most of the people were burned.
Because they were considered to be heretics, and burning at the stake was the common way for a heretic to die.
So to me, I would have maybe instead of called her bloody, I would have maybe said burning Mary or something, because I don't think of blood when I think of dying by fire. I can't think of I don't know, the being drowned thing is terrible, but the being burned at the stake thing.
Don't you think maybe Bloody Mary is just easier to say than Ashy Mary or
something like that? Yeah.
Charcoal Mary.
Charcoal Mary, yeah.
I mean, Don watched several things on Cranmer yesterday, so I saw several kind of drawings and pictures of burning. So I knew that he had been burned at the stake, and I've certainly heard about others. I mean, even Nero and things like that burning Christians. But the thing about the Fox's Book of Martyrs, like, are the majority of people that are in that book people that Mary had put to death?
No, I mean, they're throughout history.
I was going to say, I thought it was throughout history, not just.
Yeah, they're throughout history, but just realized here I've been teaching today under the, and it's okay, I've been teaching under the Storm Geo banner, not that one, so I'll make that change now. Yeah.
So when
somewhere beheaded. In fact, somewhere beheaded and burned to add insult to injury.
So when it says that she ordered that a Fox's Book of Martyrs be placed in every church so that the sacrifice would be long remembered, is what exactly is that referring to? Is she,
That's referring to she had Fox's book here was recently new. That included a lot of the martyrs that were also from the Mary period. So she wanted people to remember as she was charting this middle course of what had been. And
so kind of the sacrifice of not having the Protestant thinking.
well, the sacrifice of those who gave their lives for what was now back the recognized thing, the Protestant thinking.
Okay.
That had been attacked under Mary. Here's the irony to me of this whole thing. We've talked about Henry, we've talked about Edward, 9 Days of Jane Grey, we've talked about Mary, now we're talking about Elizabeth. It can certainly be argued that because Elizabeth reigned for a long time and stabilized things, we're going to look at one last thing here, that she was probably more the force in making England ultimately Protestant because it got stable underneath her and she took this middle course. But I think you can also argue of the ones that we've talked about today, besides Elizabeth, who do you think probably had more influence on making England Protestant?
You mean more than Henry? It would definitely be Elizabeth because she reigned for so long.
I would agree that ultimately that's where we see it put out, but I would argue that actually you shouldn't undersell how important Mary was in terms of making England Protestant because
they ended up
it was under
saying this was too much. What Mary did was too radical.
right. So she contributed, ironically, in her zeal for Catholicism, Mary contributed a great deal towards what ultimately became Protestant England under Elizabeth. Now, if Elizabeth had only ruled for 5 years and things had gone back, who knows how that would have turned out. We can't look back under the historical what if very well of what if Elizabeth had only lived for a short period, because that's not the experience that we have, and we know the history that was. But I would argue that Mary was much more influential because what happened, this is where it's important for our chart, which is what I want to point out here. Remember, this is all happening in the top part of the chart here. We talked about how the Anglican Church really is a lot more Catholic in its appearance, but notice this dotted line. That dotted line is very important. And that dotted line sort of represents the fact that during Mary's reign for 5 years, many Protestant leaders had the choice of being killed or do what?
Recant.
Or get out of Dodge.
Oh, yeah, leave. Yeah.
And so a lot of them left England to go to the continent where they came into contact with more of the Reformed Church, particularly Calvinists that were in France, some degree with Lutheran, but a lot more of the Calvinists that were in France and Switzerland, and then the Netherlands, where there was a heavy emphasis of that, which was much closer. And so because of Mary's reign, that's pretty much why this dotted line exists, in that there was a period when elements of the Anglican Church, the Church of England, had much more contact with the other part of the Reformation that was breaking off. And so this connection exists here primarily because of Mary, and it's important because they bring back under Elizabeth the things that they had been exposed to, the theological concepts, the teachings, the arguments. They bring them back to England once it's safe to come back during Elizabeth's reign. Does that make sense? So Mary is an important figure for advancing the Protestant thought in England because she's in opposition to it and what it produces in terms of this cross-pollination between England and the continent. Ultimately, there's a settlement, sometimes referred to as the Elizabethan settlement religion. Basically, there's a new act of supremacy. The act of supremacy comes back. She's now called the Supreme Governor of the Church of England, not the Supreme Head on earth under Jesus Christ. So they lessen the language a little bit on the supremacy of the monarch. It changes who the public officials swear the oath of loyalty to. A lot of the heresy laws were repealed both ways to avoid persecution of dissenters. Catholic heretics, Protestant heretics, you're now not as likely to be burned, although there still were, or be beheaded, all of that still existed. Most of Elizabeth's persecutions were viewed as being those who opposed her politically, not those who opposed religiously. And then a new, because you need another one, the Book of Common Prayer was put out. This one, the 1559, it was made compulsory, but the penalties for disobedience were reduced. So the best way I know to describe it is Elizabeth starts charting this sort of centrist course moving forward for much of her reign. She never marries, because any marriage she would have had to a European monarch would have put England more firmly in one camp or the other. And so she sort of, plays the middle ground to a great degree moving forward. So a simple summary of the English Reformation, I like this visual of it. Henry VIII moved them from papal Catholicism to Catholicism. Edward moved them from Catholicism to Protestantism. Mary from Protestantism back to papal Catholicism. And then Elizabeth came back and moved from papal Catholicism more to Protestantism. Questions, thoughts? I'm going to ask the tough question here. What can we apply from this?
I can't help but say I
didn't
see.
live in the 1500s.
Okay, I agree with Kathy.
What was that, Kathy?
I said, I'm glad that I wasn't alive to have to endure the church in the 1500s.
Yes. Yeah.
And glad to be in this country too.
Yeah, I mean, I just think about, like, if I was in that era, in that time frame, like, and I was on that little farm someplace not near London and stuff like that, like, how would it impact me? And, again, there's not a TV so that the proclamation can be read. How long is it going to take for me to see some of the changes, and what exactly would it mean for how I was doing things? And then, like, the questions of, why is it changing? Why is it changing? What, do I really understand? And I don't know. I just,
How did the leadership in the local churches, that is the actual persons who were priests, say if George had been priest in 1563 when Edward died and Mary took over, did they kick George out, or did he just, if he got smart and went along, did he get to stay? Or
there was a little.
That's how people would have really seen differences. The radical back and forth.
There was a little bit of both. Most of them just rolled with the flow.
Wow.
Because what were they going to do other than roll with flow, right?
Yeah. It seems like I'm seeing now. I've been listening to Bruce Gore quite a bit, and he made the point in one of his lectures on this period about the Bible being translated into English and being so widely read. When people are actually getting to read the scripture, they have a whole new look on life, and on even on political authority and on their position on earth. And I can't help but see that we owe a lot as Americans to the idea of freedom of conscience and the sovereignty of the individual to the developments and for the last couple of hundred years of English history and all through this and all the way up to the Glorious Revolution.
Right.
We owe a lot to those histories that that being brought over to the American colonies.
I agree.
And all the way down into our current.
Yeah, and where we'll go next week, I hadn't originally expected to spend 3 weeks on this part, but it's important because it informs what you're talking about. The next generations of the English church, which then translates to what becomes the American church, is exactly that. I mean, there's going to be more development here. And to your point, let me go back to that slide, which is where this is important, is this connection here that happens brings back, and this is what causes, it's not as clear here, but for example, some of the places we're going to go down here on the chart, Congregationalists and Baptists, this is, yeah, it's down here on the bottom, but this was happening, well, it's happening everywhere, but this is happening in England. And it's because what we will come to know as the Puritans are reading scripture directly and getting a different understanding of scripture more in the more classic, or what had become the Reformed position, but it's an English version of the Reformation. And ultimately they become, well, there's a period of time when there's no king, when they get rid of the king, that's, you know, after James. And that is also motivated by religious thought. And that actually leads down to one of the important breaks here, which is, you know, we haven't gotten to this 1607 yet, which is where, you know, looking at things from this point of view, where Baptists break off from other Congregationalists, breaking off from Calvinists. That's a lot of this comes as going to the continent and coming back during Mary's reign, but also the next generations that have read the Bible. The Bible is in English, and they've read the Bible in English, and how that carries through with extending the Reformation in England. And even the Methodists break later, you know, under John Wesley comes from that as well.
Right.
All right. I'm going to stop the recording and stop the share.